Well, if you've closed it, why have you closed it? Time to open up again Luke chapter 22 from verse 39. Slight change of plans. We were just going to look at chapter 22, but we're going to do chapter 23 as well. So you will get home for lunch. I can promise you that. In many cities, there is a different world that only comes alive at night, when offices are empty and streets are quiet and most folk are asleep. But not everything stops. Deals are made at nighttime for drugs, for contraband, for whatever else that wouldn't be made in daylight. Messages are written and thoughtlessly sent that people would never dare compose in their normal waking hours. Darkness feels like cover. It gives the illusion that what is done there won't be seen and won't be questioned and definitely won't matter in the morning. We associate darkness with secrecy. When we don't want to be seen, what do? We dim the lights. And then you come to a passage like this in Luke's Gospel. In chapter 22, at least, the key events happen at night. So Jesus goes out to pray in the dark. And a disciple betrays him and another denies him in the dark. And false accusations against him are kind of shaped and sharpened, you guessed it, in the dark. And Jesus can even say to the mob that comes to arrest him, this is chapter 22, verse 53, "This is your hour when darkness reigns." But even when the next morning comes and the cold light of day floods in, chapter 23, the die is cast. So this is a chapter full of deeds done in darkness, and yet none of it is hidden, because what happens in the dark is fully seen by God. More than that, God is at work even in this darkness. This chapter shows us not just what people do in the dark, but what God is doing around them, despite them, through them even, in the darkness. So we're going to see two things. On the one hand, dark deeds, but on the other hand, divine plans. Those are our two headings. We have a lot of ground to cover this morning. Let's get going. Here's number one, dark deeds. The first moment of darkness for Jesus is there on the Mount of Olives. It's his distress. Look at verse 39. Jesus went out as usual to the Mount of Olives, and his disciples followed him. On reaching the place, he said to them, "Pray that you will not fall into temptation." You might remember, the theme from last week. Remember, Satan is wanting to sift the disciples, to tempt them, to test them, to bring trouble to them. And so the disciples need to pray. Temptation is near, says Jesus. Pray. Temptation is a serious business. By the way, do you think of temptation that way? Or have you just got so used to the idea that, oh, God will forgive me, that we then treat our temptation and our sin lightly? Jesus says, don't do that. He says, pray. It's urgent. It's part of the Lord's Prayer. Of course, we just prayed those words. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Is that a regular part of your prayer life? The disciples struggle to pray like this. Do you? Read on now. Jesus' own distress becomes clear. Verse 41, he withdrew about a stone's throw beyond them, knelt down and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will but yours be done." Two things are clear here. First of all is the deep distress of Jesus. If you look down, verse 44 calls it his anguish. It's the only place in the New Testament where that strong word for anguish or agony is used. Striking, isn't it? As Jesus now begins to come face to face, as it were, with his own death on the cross, Jesus is in agony at the prospect begs the question, doesn't it? Why? Why is Jesus in such agony? After all, he's faced all of the opposition and persecution that's come his way so far with kind of calmness and authority. And we tend to praise people, don't we, who face their own death with that kind of calmness. I think this began with Socrates. I read on the internet that this began with Socrates. I don't really know anything about Socrates, I've got to be honest. But the story is, he was forced to drink a cup of hemlock to end his life. It was his punishment for corrupting the youth of the day, which just shows you nothing ever really changes. And yet he drinks the poison with calmness and stoicism. He sets the tone, I think. Even many Christian martyrs in more recent centuries have done the same. Famously, I always think of those two reformers in the English church, Latimer and Ridley, burned at the stake by Queen Mary. And at that moment, Hugh Latimer is reported to have said to Ridley, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as shall never be put out." And bear in mind, he was being burned, so he even managed a pun at the same time. Here's the question. If followers of Jesus faced their own deaths calmly, why is Jesus in such anguish at the prospect? The answer can only be that Jesus is facing something greater than death. And you can tell that that's the case by the words he uses. In verse 42, he says, "Take this cup from me." Interesting. It doesn't say take this death from me. He says take this cup. Why? Well, because time and again in the scriptures, a cup represents the wrath and judgment of God. For example, here from Isaiah 51, which says, "Awake, awake, rise up, Jerusalem, you who have drunk from the hand of the Lord the cup of his wrath. You who have drained to its dregs the goblet that makes people stagger." So Jesus is facing not merely death, but the wrath of God poured out on the sins of the world. Jesus will bear that. So no wonder he staggers in the garden. And yet, here's the second thing, and yet he prays, "Not my will, but yours, Father, be done." Jesus goes willingly, not grudgingly, to the cross. So there's the distress, but next in the drama comes the detention. Read on now, verse 47. "While he was still speaking, a crowd came up, and the man who was called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus asked, 'Judas, are you betraying the Son of Man with a kiss?'" This is the betrayal of one so close. And the disciples, the other disciples, are none too happy about this, and so they whip out the swords. Remember the swords from last week? Well, they've still got them, and out they come, and an ear gets sliced off. Now, it is clear, if you cast an eye at verse 52, that it is an armed mob who have come to arrest Jesus. And so the disciples think, well, here comes an armed mob, let's we be an armed mob as well. Let's repay in kind, force with force. But later on, before his accusers, who will allege that Jesus is raising a rebellion, Jesus will say, my kingdom is not of this world. In fact, he's already told his followers that leadership in his kingdom is not to be a kind of worldly exercise of power. And so Jesus puts a stop to this, and he heals the guy's ear. But of course, that means that Jesus is seized, verse 54, arrested, detained. So there's the distress, there's the detention, and next, famously, there is the denial. Read on, verse 54. "Then seizing him, they led him away and took him to the house of the high priest. And Peter followed at a distance." Now, I think that's to Peter's credit, actually. We're not told that any of the other disciples follow. Presumably they just kind of melt away in fear into the night. But Peter follows his master. After all, Peter has just very confidently declared that he will go to prison and even to death for Jesus. All of which is about to crumble, of course. Read on, verse 55. When some there had kindled a fire in the middle of the courtyard and had sat down together, Peter sat down with them. A servant girl saw him seated there in the firelight. She looked closely at him and said, "This man was with him." But he denied it. "Woman, I don't know him," he said. Now, this is hardly a heavy inquisition by a high-powered audience. It's a servant girl who challenges him. And this is Peter, who's going to go to prison or death. And yet he crumbles. "I don't know him." And then a little later, someone else kind of catches his eye and makes the same accusation. You're one of them." "Man, I'm not." Verse 58. And then about an hour later, someone else asserts, "Yeah, you are. Certainly this fellow was with them. He's a Galilean." Peter's northern accent has obviously given him away. And so then he's kind of grasping for straws, and he gives his strongest denial yet. Look at verse 60. Peter replied, "Man, I don't know what you're talking about." Just as he was speaking, the rooster crowed. And then verse 62, Peter goes outside and weeps bitterly. Jesus knew what Peter's sin would be even before he did it. And at this moment, Peter's conscience is greatly moved. He weeps bitterly over his sin. Here's the question. Do we? Is your conscience sensitive in this way? Or when we get that sense that we know we have sinned, do we kind of just suppress that sense? Do we just tell ourselves the sweet little lies? It wasn't really wrong. Well, not very wrong anyway. And anyone else would have done the same, and it's not really my fault, and I was under pressure, and it's someone else really who caused it. And even if it was wrong, it's not really that serious. Is that us? Or do we think soberly and weep bitterly over our sin? So there's the distress, there's the detention, there's the denial. Next we get the derision. Verse 63. The men who were guarding Jesus began mocking and beating him. They blindfolded him and demanded, "Prophesy, who hit you?" And then they said many other insulting things about him. The things I think is really interesting about this part of the gospel, the arrest, the trial, the crucifixion, you kind of meet every possible reaction and response to Jesus in the different characters who encounter him. So some are hostile towards Jesus, like the religious elite. They want him dead. Some deny him, like Peter, when being connected with Jesus becomes inconvenient. Others just mock. To other people, Jesus is just a figure of fun. But whilst the soldiers mock, other more powerful figures plot. And so now we reach the trial and the decision to crucify the Lord of life. That's our next point, the decision. And there are two basic stages to Jesus' trial. First of all, he comes before the Jewish religious authorities and then before the Roman authorities. So first before the Jewish authorities. Read on now, verse 66. At daybreak, the council of the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of the law, met together, and Jesus was led before them. Now, this council is called the Sanhedrin. That the full Sanhedrin was a council of 71 men. Priests, scribes, that is like religious lawyers trained in theology, including some Pharisees, and then elders from among the people. And this council, it wielded some power, but not total control. Because, of course, Rome holds total control. Now, it was not lawful for the Sanhedrin to conduct its business at night, although really there's little doubt that they have met at night and got a kind of foregone conclusion, finding Jesus guilty. This has been cooked up overnight. And then this meeting at daybreak, which is most likely the earliest possible legal time for the council to meet, is basically convened to rubber stamp that foregone conclusion. And so it's important to know that the questions here are not really meant to genuinely investigate. They're just designed to trap Jesus in his words. For example, verse 67, if you are the Messiah, they said, tell us. But Jesus answered, if I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I asked you, you would not answer. You might ask, by the way, why is Jesus so elusive in his answers at his trial? It kind of seems like he won't give a straight answer to the Jewish authorities, and likewise, in a minute, we'll see he's kind of elusive before Pilate, and in front of Herod, he won't speak at all. Is Jesus suddenly unsure of his own identity? Well, no. There are two reasons, therefore, for Jesus' reluctance, I think. Firstly, because these are not real questions, and this is not a proper trial. At one level, why engage with questions that are just meant to trick and to trap? These are not straight questions. They don't really deserve to be dignified with straight answers, therefore. The second reason, though, I think has to do with language. So here they ask if he is the Messiah or the Christ. But the fact is that throughout the Gospels, people have continually misunderstood what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. They imagine this means he's a kind of political leader or a military commander. But Jesus has again and again stressed that his kingdom is not like that. It's not like the powers of this world. And so at one level, if the question to Jesus is, are you a Messiah as we imagine it? Well, the answer is no. On the other hand, the straightforward answer to the question, are you the Messiah, is yes. But it's not worth, as Jesus says here, it's not worth him kind of, dialoguing with them. What do you mean by Messiah? Let's talk about that. It's not worth that dialogue because they are not listening. If I told you, you wouldn't believe me. If I engage you in questions, you wouldn't listen. As far as they are concerned, he's just a blasphemer and they want him dead. And the next answer, therefore, that Jesus gives kind of seals his fate. Verse 69, he goes on, but from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God. Now, you or I may or may not pick this up, but there is an allusion here, and the Sanhedrin know this very well. There is an allusion to Daniel chapter 7, because there that the Son of Man is a divine figure at the right hand of God. And you can tell that they pick up on his allusion because of their very next question. They all asked, are you the Son of God then? And he replied, you say I am. Why another elusive response? Well, again, they won't believe in whatever he says. And again, their understanding of what that phrase means may very well be different to his. But anyway, either way, that the die is cast. This is blasphemy as far as they're concerned, and so he must die. But here's the problem. They don't have the authority to take this forward. They've got to involve the Roman powers. But there's a further problem, because the Roman powers are unlikely to be moved by an accusation of Jewish religious blasphemy. Why would the Romans care? And so a new track must be taken and new allegations fabricated. So that brings us to the Roman authorities. And read on now from chapter 23, verse 1. Then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, we have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes payment of taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king. So here we get three new, or shall we say, massaged or adjusted accusations designed now to appeal to Rome, to show that this guy isn't just a religious blasphemer, but also a political danger. He's involved in sedition, they say. He's raising a rebellion, which of course is not true. He opposes taxes to Caesar, they claim. Hit the Romans in the pocket, they won't like that. Again, it's not true. In fact, the complete opposite is true. Remember, Jesus is asked, should we pay taxes? And he looks at the coin. Whose face is it? Caesar? Fine, give it to Caesar. and he claims to be a king, they allege, which again is not true, at least not true in the sense of him being a political threat with a political rebellion. And here's the thing. It's all nonsense, and Pilate knows it. He's not stupid, he sees through it all. Look at verse 4. Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, "I find no basis for a charge against this man." It's all nonsense. But of course, Pilate is in a bind now. The Sanhedrin will not leave him alone, but he doesn't want to do anything with this guy. But then his get-out-of-jail-free card comes. Verse 5, he hears Jesus is from Galilee. Great. Because if he's from Galilee, well, he can be under Herod's jurisdiction. And what do you know? Herod just so happens to be in town because it's the Passover festival. And so, you can picture his relief, right? Jesus is punted off to Herod, which just goes to show bureaucracy never changes, right? It's just shifted from one desk to someone else. You sort out this problem. And so, verse 8, when Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased, because for a long time he had been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform a sign of some sort. He plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. You see, Herod wants Jesus for his plaything, right? He wants a party trick. Come on, perform a sign, make it good. And so Jesus will not even speak to him. I think there's a warning here for us. Again, I think we see almost every possible imaginable reaction to Jesus in these verses. And by the way, I think we're being invited to consider, am I like that? See, Herod wants to hear Jesus' teaching. Okay, it kind of amuses him. It interests him. It tickles his ear on a Sunday morning. And a miracle or two would be nice, right? Let's have a show. Is that us? We're amused or interested to hear teaching about Jesus. We wouldn't mind a miracle or two. But we won't really seriously orient our lives around Jesus. Don't be like Herod. So anyway, Herod punts Jesus back to Pilate. The wheels of bureaucracy turn again. And what follows is essentially that the Roman governor just trying to make the problem go away. Jesus is clearly innocent, but the Sanhedrin clearly won't give any peace until Jesus is killed. Just listen to how one commentator sums it up. He says, "The Gospels make it plain that Pilate tried hard to avoid making a decision. He started by trying to get the Jews to deal with this whole matter themselves." We see that in John's Gospel. Later, he sent Jesus to Herod, verse 7. He attempted to get the Jews to accept Jesus as a prisoner to be released at Passover. Remember the swap with Barabbas? We'll get to that in a minute. And he offered to beat Jesus and then just release him. But in the end, he could not avoid making the fateful decision. There's no fence to sit on for Pilate in the end. And again, let me ask you, do you see yourself in Pilate? Do you think you can just sit on the fence forever about Jesus? Nice, interesting guy, seems like a good guy. But we'll see. I'll hedge my bets. I'll keep my options open. Pilate's example shows you cannot do that with Jesus. In the end, you have to make a decision. Are you with or against? Or are you in his camp or the other? This is a passage full of dark deeds. Deeds done in the darkness. But in case you think that these are chapters all about Jesus being at the mercy of all these dark forces, well, think again, because it's also at the same time a chapter full of, here's point number 2 now, full of divine plans. Point number 2 is much shorter than point number 1. Here's the question: who is really in charge here? Like, at one level, it absolutely does not look like Jesus, does it? Right? He gets arrested. He gets detained. His disciples, well, one betrays him. Another denies him, and the rest abandon him. He's not looking very powerful, is he? And then he gets carted round from pillar to post, right? People tell him where to go, from this ruler to that one to the other. He appears before people of authority, but he himself does not look like the authority, does he? He looks like the powerless, not the powerful in this passage. But if you think that, you have completely and utterly missed the point. At every turn, at every stage, Jesus is actually conducting, directing, governing. He's in charge of events. When his disciples want to take things into their own hands, he commands non-violence and non-resistance at the point of his arrest. Jesus willingly, not grudgingly, willingly submits to the plans of his Father there in the garden. Jesus correctly predicts Peter's denial. Jesus kind of rises above the kind of pastimes of powerful men like Herod. He won't speak to Herod. Like, at one level, it's the vehement accusations of the Sanhedrin that make Pilate, the Roman governor, go against his instincts and sentence Jesus to death. At one level, that's true. But at another level, a deeper level, there's a hidden hand at work. Jesus defines the terms. He will not answer questions in the way that they want. He's not the Messiah as they imagine it, but as he really is. Remember this verse? I think we saw it last week back in chapter 22, verse 22. I think this is the key verse in the whole section. The Son of Man will go as it has been decreed. The question is, decreed by whom? There's a plan here. Whose plan is it? It's God's plan. It's Jesus' plan. He is definitely, deliberately, according to his own design, heading to the cross, to his own death, to bear the wrath of God at sin, to suffer and die in your place for your sin, for your salvation, if you'll have him and trust him as your Savior. Even in Barabbas, you see God at work. That there's a wonderful, I ever noticed this, there's a wonderful picture of the gospel in Barabbas. Remember, there's this whole thing about there's a custom, right, at Passover, a kind of, goodwill in the community thing, like we'll release a prisoner at Passover time. And of course, this is another way in which, like, Pilate thinks he's got out of the bind. It's like, well, I'll put Jesus up against Barabbas, right, who really has been involved in sedition and murder and all the rest. Like, he's a bad dude. And we're going to put them up together, and surely the crowd will choose Jesus. But they won't, and they don't. And they choose Barabbas instead. And commenting on Barabbas, I read this a couple of weeks ago. Here's what one preacher said. It's amazing words. He says, he, Barabbas, was the only man in the world who could say that Jesus Christ took his physical place. Right? Barabbas goes free, Jesus is held. But I can say that Jesus Christ took my spiritual place. For it was I who deserved to die. It was I who deserved that the wrath of God should be poured on me. I deserved the eternal punishment in the lake of fire. He was delivered up for my offenses. He was handed over to judgment because of my sins. Christ was my substitute. He was satisfying the debt of divine justice and holiness. And that is why I can say that Christianity can be expressed in the three phrases. I deserved hell. Jesus took my hell. There is therefore nothing left for me but his heaven. Isn't that wonderful? So here's the thing. Christ will go to his cross. And not because the dark powers are scheming, although they are. And not because the civic authorities are spineless, although in Pilate they are. And not by accident, but by design. Not their design, but God's design, in our place to the cross, for our sake, for our salvation. Let's pray together, shall we?